there are many, many small trans streamers who need amplification. And if anything, you should be reaching out more and trying really, really hard to find reasons for them to make the cut. Because the reason I got it is that I just, quote, didn't make the cut. Now, that's possible. But when the argument is like, oh, well, we already have people, well, my argument is it's good, but it's not diverse enough.
I can't just have trans people on the shows where we're talking about trans issues. I cannot just have black people on the show where I'm just talking about
You
black.
just have trans
Let,
people, though. That's not what I'm asking either.
please let me fit. I just said
But
fuck.
you're mischaracterizing my
No,
argument.
I'm not. You didn't listen to me. You didn't listen to me.
If we're going to be asking ourselves, well, who are real trans allies? It's the people who aren't just in it for optics, aren't just in it in ways that only suit them. And most importantly, it's the ways in which people will not perpetuate the violence against trans people with the things that they do.
Like if I was to you, like I'd be like, you know, you've done some terrible things to some people, and you're like, who? It's like, oh, I can't say. So you see how frustrating that is?
Confrontations with these people talking to you about it. You're just ignoring that.
Well, is this about no comment chick? Is that what this is about, or is this about like who?
Multiple people.
Okay, well then, if I've disagreed with it at the time, then I probably have valid reason. I probably agree with myself.
Like that's really convenient. I'm saying,
But yeah, but it's also very convenient that you can't even name names, so we can't. So we just gotta say the specter of trans people are against you, Dylan. Like it's
basically.
Okay.
I don't want to like. I'm giving a sense of hostility, I guess. I'm not feeling hostile towards you people. I just don't think there's enough criticism of what's really going on in the space you're occupying versus how it could be used for actually protecting trans people.
So I missed a lot of this conversation, so I think I should just like return to like when I was added and when I was entered the conversation.
Sure.
So I think like starting it by like reading like the original messages as like a starting point that you like set in my direction.
I was all over the place, and you're gonna have me on a lot of stuff I'm gonna need to clarify on, so I apologize.
Okay, so Danabo made a tweet like declaring that we're going to have a SCOTUS special, which meant that we were trying to get on as many lawyers as possible, people with like legal knowledge. That included people like Pisco, Lecture Fan, people who are like certified by the bar, because we wanted to try to bring on people. We get a criticism all the time, like we don't bring on enough experts. So we wanted to bring on people who actually like know legal stuff for that. And so there's not a lot of black lawyers in the space. There isn't like a lot of people of color who are lawyers in the space, and that's bad. I wish that was different, but that isn't the state of the space. And you like retweeted it, and you said like, wonder how many colored and trans streamers they skipped to wind up with 4 white lamenters. The fake leftism show must go on. I guess like for me, like, should I have like who should I have brought on in place of like the lawyers in our space who are predominantly white?
Well, I don't actually criticize you for bringing on experts. I appreciate that. And if they are experts, then my left-right dichotomy does fall apart. However, my general criticism, and again, like I said, I was all over the place, and I was probably responding a bit too quickly at first. But my overall problem is that if you're going to be asking for experts on SCOTUS, and that seems like a valid way to gatekeep, then what about experts on trans issues?
I will let anybody discuss SCOTUS, as I just wanted to make a special show where we brought on lawyers specifically for SCOTUS. Because the difference between like being a lawyer and not being a lawyer is there's like a huge like wealth of knowledge about like legal terms and legal debate that I feel like non-lawyers are not privy to when it comes to certain terms that lawyers might use in their arguments. That isn't like known by most people in our space. That makes the argument more interesting because I think people can like be taught through the legalese. But I only am going to do like a one special edition for this. I have had people discuss the SCOTUS stuff who are not lawyers, just like no legal experience whatsoever, but they do their own research and come to their own opinion. This is more of like a unique show in the way that I want it to specifically be like dominated by lawyers, right? People who are lawyers and have experience as that. But there's not only going to be lawyers there because there's just not enough lawyers in the space. Just like anytime, like let's say we're going to have an issue, like it's a trans issue, we're going to have people who are trans activists or involved, like Josie Rose, for example, who's been involved in trans legislation and trans activism for a while. Riley Grace Rochong, I've brought on before in the past, who's been involved in trans activism in my state. I've done really good work in my state as well.
I'm just going to point out that from a truly leftist perspective, Riley's and I try not to name names, but you did anyways. Uh,
Yeah.
Riley's allyship is limited, and I'm not saying she shouldn't be brought on, but like again, we have to realize that when it's only on average one person per panel, and it's you're easily finding several people who are just full stop against it, sometimes more rhetorically than from an expert position. Then there's a degree to which that one side can overpower the other, right?
I mean, there is a degree. I would say that in most situations, the left perform very well on the show, and I get to set the terms of debate when it comes to you will not misgender, you will not
Sure.
misgender people, you will not attack people's immutable characteristics, which is rules set in place that no other debate show on the platform even has.
I mean, in the
And
end,
I,
though, a lot of trans
well,
people
let
come
me.
on. If I just really quickly though, because when we talk
Hmm.
about immutable characteristics, that's fine within the panel space. But how,
Hmm.
like, as far as like stuff against trans people being normalized, it seems to be pretty rampant within your actual community because trans people get harassed by your community and by adjacent communities just for being on the panel a lot of the time.
Well, first, let me just say, you said before we move on to that, you said something about like, well, from a leftist perspective. Let me be clear. I'm not a socialist. I'm not a communist. I don't care if it's a leftist perspective or not. And so, like any appeal to Dylan, like this is bad for leftism, like the idea of like socialism, Marxism, anarcho-communism, Maoism, like I just don't care because I'm not a socialist. I would consider myself left wing in the American sense, as maybe you could say social democrat. There's a socialist tradition, but my main interest here isn't to advance socialism when I do my
Well,
show.
could you elaborate on what your main interests with the show are?
I
Because
think my main interest with the show is I think one, I want it to be entertaining. I want it to be an entertaining show. I think if we're on Twitch, we need to make politics entertaining because this is a video game platform. And if we make it like a classroom or if we make it boring, nobody's going to watch. If you look at all the top streamers in the space politically, none of them are educational. Like, we're going to sit down and read a book about like the future of anarcho-communism and the post-polarity world of Maoist. Like, nobody watches that. And it's because, not because that content isn't at all useful, right? Maybe if you're a Maoist, it isn't useful. But it's because this is a video game space. We are already kind of living here almost on borrowed time for the fact that we're not even supposed to be here. And since we've made a community here, we need to make it entertaining if we're going to make anyone outside of just complete political nerds pay attention to us. I also do want people to get some education out of it. I do think my show does convince some people, maybe not a ton, but I have gotten emails from people who have been convinced. And I also want to make sure that if debates are happening on Twitch, that we can set the terms to some degree, making sure that like misgendering will be banned and that you cannot attack people's mutable characteristics, and we have some level of order, because all of the other like debate shows didn't have these rules set in place beforehand. And so having these structures where we can set the like standard for like this is the type of behavior that isn't allowed, period, I think is good.
well, I mean, it can only be a start. Um, I'm not asking you to be a leftist. That's just to be super clear. I think you get a lot of credit for being a trans ally, which is what I'm addressing with the usage of your
Mhm.
space here. It's not completely useless, and it's very much symbolically valid to be a trans ally in a way that is meaningful to you. But we also like, if we're going to be asking ourselves, well, who are real trans allies? It's the people who aren't just in it for optics, aren't just in it in ways that only suit them. And most importantly, it's the ways in which people will not perpetuate the violence against trans people with the things that they do. And here's my problem. So you said that this is about entertainment. And I understand the need to grow like that to appeal to entertainment. I certainly have not tried to do that, and I'm not a streamer in that sense. I'm just strictly a debater. So I probably didn't qualify for the epidemic. I'm willing to accept that. I'm not even doing panels anymore. So it's nothing. It's not like I'm trying to reclaim a spot I never had. What my problem is though is that when it's just about entertainment, then the actual like not every trans issue is black and white or entertaining. In fact, a lot of them are very not entertaining, and going through them can be pretty tedious because if you're going to get into it, like it's not convenient. And when it comes to advocating for ourselves, like, yeah, there are people who can make it snappy and quick, but not actually advocate for the entire issue. But like, we don't have the luxury of being entertaining when we're advocating for ourselves, really. Like, that's probably a special skill that somebody can like master, but I'm pretty neurodivergent myself, so it's beyond my sense of comprehension. I'm just being me at this point. And my biggest problem is that when it's easier to like, in one of my other posts, I said, I guess if you're trans and you want to be on the hippy dippy, you might as well pretend to be a fascist because that'll make you more viable. And I am sticking with that point is that there is like without any reward for merit here and without any recognition of who's actually winning the conversation, it allows both sides to pretend like they're winning the conversation perpetually. Now, I don't know if you knew this, but trans people are the statistical minority as well. So if we're trying to say like our points are valid above all the other people who are first of all referring to normativity, but secondly also screaming that their points are valid, who do you think that the people in between are going to hear, especially on places like Twitter and stuff like that? So I think it's
I don't
valid for people to question if you're a trans ally when your space isn't actually conducive to discussions about trans issues that truly advocate for our needs.
I guess primarily I don't view. I guess there's a few things I want to say here. The first thing would be I do believe the type of argument you make comes into effect when people are like deciding if you made a good argument or not. I don't think it's just simply like, hey, like this person was yelling and say they were right, this person was yelling and said they were right, so they must both have valid points. If you like, everybody thinks they're right, but certain people get humiliated on my show, absolutely humiliated. They can do very well in debate and they can have good rhetoric, or somebody can get like absolutely blown out because they didn't really think about what they were saying. So I don't think it's as simple as, well, they both think they're right, so people are just gonna automatically side with the person who's appealing to like
I'm not even talking about on the panel. I'm saying that when you constantly have the same debate over and over again, it allows these people to give the performance as a whole that it's never changed. And I want to point out too, a lot of the leftists,
Mhm.
a lot of the leftists and trans streamers who make it on are already kind of amplified. Whereas
Mhm.
I've seen a lot of smaller far right people make it on. And the difference between this is something called post amplification and pre amplification. Post amplification means that you're already amplifying. Well, I guess I just explained that. So the key thing is though that there are many small trans streamers who need amplification, and if anything, you should be reaching out more and trying really hard to find reasons for them to make the cut. Because the reason I got, and I'm not, like I said, I'm not going to get into it because it's not about me, is that I just quote didn't make the cut. Now that's possible, but when the argument is like, oh, well, we already have people. Well, my argument is it's good, but it's not diverse enough. It's certainly
Okay.
like I said, some of them fall short of like advocating for trans issues that actually would prevent more violence against
So
us.
some people can advocate for trans issues that might prevent more violence, or do like advocate for the best stuff, but just be shit at it. Yeah, that happens all the time.
But the hard work is really
Well, you
humanizing
didn't.
somebody.
You
I'll let you finish. Sorry.
The hard work is really humanizing someone. It's hard to humanize somebody when they sound like a dumbass, and I run into this issue a lot because I feel like a lot of people like come onto the show thinking that like they like have all these ideas in their head and they like mapped it out in their head and they know why they're right, and like they think that they can get on the debate show and they're going to be the person who says like the revolutionary thing that convinces everybody, or they got it all mapped out, and then they come on the show, hippy dippy recruitment, this is the reason we have it, and they end up saying the same thing everybody else is saying, or they don't say it in a convincing nature, they don't make the argument well, or they're not able to drag people in to make them listen to them, or they just kind of choke. There could be a million reasons why somebody doesn't make it from the hippy dippy recruitment onto hippy dippy. 90% of the people who go on hippy dippy recruitment don't end up making it on the hippy dippy roundtable. Now, when it comes to this, so I would say that like when it comes to it not being diverse enough, on average, when it comes to being on our like show, if you're trans, we have a higher percentage of trans people on our show than there are in the general population. Um, Most larger trans streamers in their space have been on our show, And for the smaller trans streamers who haven't, we have hosted trans streamers before. In fact, we just hosted a trans masculine streamer. I think it was the last episode. Who is a very small streamer. For the ones who don't come on, I mean, we don't just look at the fact if somebody's trans or not. We also look at their just general, like, whether we think they're doing well or not in the recruitment show. And if they don't do well, we don't bring them on. Because the worst thing we could do, in my opinion, when it comes to hosting trans voices, is hosting someone solely because they're trans. Just saying, you know what we need to do? We're going to pick a transport voice out of the crowd so we can get permission to have a conversation here. Because we know that if we don't have a trans person on, we're going to get a lot of heat. So we're just going to take whatever trans person we can find, have them on the show, so we look like we're being inclusive and progressive. I don't want to be like that. I want to make sure that if I do have a trans person on my show, that they're good at making an argument, they're good at advocating for whatever they believe, and they show a perspective that can drag people in, right? That's going to be what, like, a lot of my main interests, right?
So
Also,
from
real
an
quick,
optics angle, sure.
sorry, I wanted to jump in just to say one thing, since we're talking about recruitment and the process of recruiting, is that just beside big guests, we're not usually going towards people. Like, it's something that like we have like a Discord set up like for this. Like we got a channel in the Discord of Dylan. Danabo got also a channel for recruitment. And basically we just spread the word out through like the YouTube video and everything. So there's not really like, we don't reach out to people. But after that, if you have names, I would be happy to, you know, like feel free to send them to Danabo. He's the one in charge of this. Anyway, sorry.
Sure, I have at least someone I can think of, even though I don't agree with all their politics. It's not necessarily about that to me. I think when it comes to having the same discussion over and over again, and then having a lot of the same streamers because they're bigger, there is an issue here. And when you say particularly it's hard to humanize someone when they sound like a dumbass, well, that's kind of actually the luxury that reactionaries have, because A, their positions are already stronger because they're referring to normativity, which are more popular by default. Fighting for trans rights is opposing normativity, which, when you're talking about like confronting neoliberalism, puts us like at the disadvantage rhetorically. And statistically speaking, we're way more dehumanized than reactionaries. Like in leftist spaces, they're pretty dehumanized, but in the not leftist spaces that you say you're a part of, or you constitute a part of, I should say, that's actually not very common. In fact, it's more common to give them credit where they don't deserve it. And the reason they think it deserves credit is because they don't actually have the experiences of the people they're trying to defend, almost as like a counter reactionaryism. And this is what I mean by fake trans allyship, is that you can't just say that you're pro-trans and because you think that transphobes are bad. You have to say you're pro-trans because you think that they deserve to be humanized. And I don't think your space is actually humanize trans people as a whole.
I do think it does humanize trans people. I just disagree with that. But
what I'm saying is I don't think it pulls them up enough.
It pulls them up enough. So what you're asking for is for me to just platform more smaller trans voices, basically, right?
Well,
and I would say I will do that if they're good at debate. I'll platform them. But I mean, when it comes to this idea that like the conservatives on my show get the like early advantage because they're appealing for normative ethics or like
not because because of the reasons you said, for sure.
Okay, for like because they're the ones
saying that they don't risk dehumanization as easily as trans debaters.
Yes, but they achieve it almost every show I do. They achieve being dehumanized almost every show I do, because the fact of the matter is, if you look at a Dylan Burns live chat, if you look at Dylan Burns comment sections on one of these videos, the people getting flamed overwhelmingly, the large amount of the time, are not going to be left-wingers. They're not going to be trans people. It's not going to be the people who are making the left-wing arguments. It's usually going to be the right-wingers, right? It's usually going to be the right-wingers who are getting the most flamed, or getting the most dunked on, or getting the most disrespect. In fact, there's been many right-wingers who completely have like discounted me and don't come on my show anymore because they didn't get enough respect from my community. A big obvious case of this.
And I think they're idiots, actually, because right-wingers also have the advantage of just simply getting clout from negative attention. Negative attention to them does not necessarily mean negative existence. Whereas the exact opposite seems to be true for a lot of trans streamers in this space. I am going to point out one. No, I really can't point out names because I know that there's going to be they're going to be targeted after this. Not because of you. I'm just saying just because that's the nature of this space. And when I say the nature of the space, I also have to point out that like that is the privilege that I'm talking about, where I have a lot more to lose, even I feel personally, from the negative attention, because people will use that against me forever. Whereas like these people that you're bringing on, they hoard it. And they're probably the ones who keep coming on because they know that there's actually no difference between being told that they're right and getting reach, or being told that they're wrong, sorry, and getting reach.
I guess like the thing is, a lot of people get reach on our show, but don't succeed the same way other people do. And I can say like a lot of them, Christian Watson, and Endernax, these people like didn't appreciate the way my community behaved towards them. They thought it was too aggressive, too mean, too dismissive. And you can say that that's dumb or not because they appreciate the negative attention, but like people being insulted or called like fascist or Nazi scum or stuff like that, they're still gonna like receive that in an extremely negative manner. And being labeled in those ways aren't necessarily always helpful to you. There's a lot of people on my
On the other,
show.
sorry.
There's a lot of right wingers on my show who have never really grown from hippy dippy or have only slightly grown from hippy dippy, but have helped by coming onto my show. Left wingers gain a lot of attention and access to an audience. Demon Mama is somebody who grew a lot from Hippy Dippy. Not that I made her or anything, but she grew a lot from Hippy Dippy. There are a lot of other people like Heem who grew a lot from Hippy Dippy. There's a lot of left wingers who grew from Hippy Dippy. I can name a lot more left wingers who grew from Hippy Dippy and grew their audiences from Hippy Dippy than I can right wingers. In fact, I can't even put the amount of right wingers who grew from Hippy Dippy really on like I could count them all on one hand. And I think their names are CTV, and like that's it really. Maybe Rob, but not really. Even I would say Rob got his audience on his own.
It's hard for me to quantify, and I am speaking in a way where this is my perception. I didn't come in here expecting to be totally right. I figured some of these were weak points. The other side of this, though, is not necessarily you know, are people recognizing transphobia? Because yes, they are. That's not an issue. The question is, are they recognizing cis normativity and misogyny against trans people when they're being harassed in your space as a result of being on the same panel as another person who is not only reactionary but cultivates these kind of spaces? I think the answer is sadly no. And I think being vigilant of these things and recognizing when certain people's communities are backhandedly harmful is incredibly important and part of listening to trans people, even if you don't see it firsthand, because that's the biggest problem. A lot of violence against trans people in these spaces has become subversive for the reasons that you're stating, and because a lot of people feel complacent with oh well, I've stopped misgendering, I've stopped personal attacks, now I don't have to worry. Well, no, now people could just be backhanded, and it's sure, you might say it's out of your control, but it's something that affects us terminally, no matter where we go. I've experienced it in several debate spaces. Just saying one thing wrong after actually embarrassing somebody on an issue that matters. And after that, it's just nonstop hostility from that entire community, not from everybody in the community. This is what I'm saying. Nothing I'm saying relies on absolutes. It's just more consideration. Now, you did a ways back say oh, well, you want me to have more small trans streamers on. I don't think it's just that. I think you have to both recognize that you occupy a space right now that could be used for something other than entertainment purposes, but for actual trans advocacy, for starters. Now, I'm not saying it ends there. I'm just saying that when it comes to us recognizing what your space represents to us, it's a space where the rhetoric about us gets rehashed and never actually moves forward. I'm going to stick with that. I also think that, like I said, it's a space where this backhanded harassment can proliferate and we're exposed to it, but through the lens of transphobia only being transphobia and nothing more, then like this stuff does proliferate, and I think that's probably the most common complaint I've heard from other trans people about your space, because I've never been on your panel
It's
exactly.
backhanded harassment. You says
Not from you, from the people who are on the new panels.
Okay, so it'd be their community. So it's not my community that's the problem. It's the people's.
I've seen your community be very hostile, but I'm reluctant to go 100% on that. I think it's way more of a concern from truly reactionary spaces.
I don't really think my community is really that much of. I think my community is vicious, but I don't think like attacks on identity or attacks about identity is something that my community really
But
practices.
it's not
a
attacks
large
on
amount.
identity. Like I said, like that's the shallow perspective of how this stuff proliferates.
So like what do you mean exactly? Like harass, because when you talk about like harassing trans people, right? How would my community then harass a trans person? Like how is it done that, or how does it do that?
It's a generalized hostility that treats the trans persons as if their points are less valuable than they are, and forms rhetorics against them that doesn't actually like rely on what truly happened, because since their voices are minimized and confined to the left a lot of the time, a lot of people can say things that proliferate regardless of what we want to be true. And
So
again, I
so the
wish I could
problem
bring up
is
examples, but I
they
can't bring
disagree.
it up without knowing that something will start, because this is how it
Okay.
generally happens. Names
Well,
get mentioned in a negative, names get mentioned by a negative way by somebody with influence, and this is what happens. And then they say, I'm getting pushed out of this space, I'm going to leave now, and they never appear on your panel again.
Okay. So I guess like when it comes to the idea that there's people in my community it sounds like you're saying they disagree with the trans person's point, but their disagreements are not valid, and they're trying to
They're rooted in dehumanizing the other person and not giving them an actual argument.
dehumanizing the other person. If somebody dehumanizes another person just to dehumanize them because they're trans or in any way related to really any dehumanization, period, then that usually would be meted with a ban or at least some form of punishment. It like we'll allow like certain insults, like you're a fucking moron or stuff like that, but that like is thrown at everybody across the board. But if there's anything that we think is related to them being trans, it'll usually result in a timeout and then followed with a ban.
I'm saying that these things that can be universally applied get disproportionately applied in a way that actually reflects misogyny to trans people when they have valid points, and that is
So what you're saying is this is like veiled
just,
misogyny when they disagree with the trans person.
and plus the attack with numbers, and more specifically, is the important thing.
There's not. I guess if the idea is that some of my viewers could be in their souls or like in parts of them misogynistic or transphobic, and they're not making transphobic arguments or saying transphobic things when they disagree with the trans person about an issue that is important, that it could be under the guise of transphobia or misogyny.
Well, again, this is
like there's no way to account for this.
Too atomized. I'm talking more in like a general way where the community itself doesn't seem to recognize when this is happening. When trans people say it's happening, people say, well, I don't recognize it. And then they get pushed away from the spaces and feel excluded by their treatment, not just from your community, which I would imagine is not like usually as bad, but not also the type to exactly like fight off people in the way that you're saying, or in the way that we're demanding. Whereas on the other hand, like it's more so from reactionary communities that particularly are bad for going behind the scenes to get back at people who do dehumanize or embarrass them, I should say, on your panel.
So the main issue seems to be the reactionary communities that are coming in then, and that they interact with on these panels, who might go off and do.
Yeah, it's typically the fact that a trans person can't get onto your panel without at some point down the line facing some sort of harassment by exposing themselves, because you bring on people who on the surface don't say transphobic things, but their communities are incredibly weaponized against trans people.
Yeah, I would say that like right-wing voices, like on Twitch that I've interacted with, there are definitely instances where there are members with their community that are very toxic towards just queer people in general, or just minority groups in general. And I've seen people like afterwards like use certain like slurs directed at me, or they have gone in and just said the most disgusting things about for example, I'm in Ukraine right now, so like Ukrainians, for example, they like go after them, like, oh, they're just Western gay lap dogs for the like homo West or whatever. And like the the thing is, anytime you interact with the right, that's gonna be a risk that comes with that. And the best thing you can do is when they engage in that behavior in your chats and your communities, is you ban them and purge them. But that is 100% like a risk that just comes with engaging with people who you disagree with of a right wing persuasion. I guess
And I
the
guess
key
again,
the
at the
key
same
is
time,
yeah.
I did think that was the end of your sentence. I'm tending to let you and Mr. Geek finish whenever you speak, so please.
The key is for me, I guess, like deciding where you're gonna put the line in the sand when it comes to who you bring on and what communities they bring with them, um, and how destructive they can be to just like having an inviting community overall.
Well, and I think it's more specifically like you have a power here, and by being kind of laissez-faire about it, this is the result we've gotten. And so I think we are at a point where people who are real trans allies will say, well, trans people feel pushed out because the onus isn't actually on them not to be harassed. So what are you going to actually do so trans people can feel included? Because while you can say it's just the way things are that this happens, part of being actually like progressive and fighting for emancipation is not accepting the way things are. Like I said, we don't accept appeals to normativity as an actual left. And so my question is for you, like, how is it invalid for someone like me to say that you're actually working against the trans fight when you're saying that like, well, this is the way things are, it's inherently more violent towards trans people who have more to lose than it is against reactionaries who have the status quo to fall back on.
I don't see it as I am just accepting things as they are currently. It's more of an acknowledgement of the current political reality within the United States that the right wing in this country has a lot of transphobia.
So should
And
a trans
it
ally protect trans people?
should a trans ally protect trans people? Yes.
So, and in your position, you're absolutely certain that despite the fact that you bring on these reactionaries that lead to the harassment of trans people, and despite the fact that you have these standards where other trans streamers can't make the cut, there's nothing you can do to actually change the flow of this dynamic, which I'm trying to
Well,
point out to you is working against trans people in this space right now.
I guess for me, if I bring on trans people who are worse at debate, who are worse at presenting like good arguments, and are worse in dealing with these situations,
But
it's
I'm
only
not
going to make the
asking that.
situation worse.
That's a mischaracterization of my.
But wait, but the
I'm going to stop you now just because I want to explain.
well,
Because
but I
I'm
don't want you to stop me
specifically,
now because I'm not done. Okay.
maybe I should clarify because you did not get that right.
Okay. Continue.
I'm not saying to simply have on worse trans streamers. I'm saying to have on good trans streamers, but also maybe less experienced streamers who have to grow. And more specifically, I think with the power that you hold, you can also you can also offer a lot of constructive criticism on how these streamers can be more entertaining and work against the right wing better. But I don't think that like rejecting the power of networking that you have here is actually the solution. I think it's only going to perpetuate
We
this issue.
we have built a system that no other show in our space has, which is the Hippy Dippy Recruitment Show, which is designed to do this. Where you're supposed to go onto the smaller platform, learn how the system works, learn how to like talk in front of an audience, learn how these debate panels work, and then once you're good enough, or we think you're going to be good enough for the main show, then we're going to take you from that and put you on the main show.
But
We've
why don't you
developed that system.
communicate with people though what they need to do? Because I've never gotten
Like
that.
what they need to do to improve, like and get onto the main show.
I've even DM'd multiple
It
people.
it is I guess the main issue is we have, I guess, through all of our shows we have 16 people on every week. We have 8 people on the main show, we have 8 people on the smaller show. That's 16 people every week 16 people
I
every
just-
week. If you look at, let's
Yeah,
say
I
it's
don't
4
think
or
you're being
5.
specific though,
God.
for people to know what to do.
So we're talking about 60 to like, I guess that's like what, 36 to 40 something character like debate reviews every month. Like we honestly, we just can't manage that many like debate reviews. Like if somebody like also there's also another issue is we tried that and it went terribly. We tried that originally with Hippie Dippy recruitment
Tried
and we
what?
got
Sorry.
a ton of complaints when we actually did that.
Sorry, try what specifically?
When we tried to give people honest reviews, that it did not
Oh.
end well. Because
Oh, yeah,
what
no.
they felt very offended. They didn't like my honesty because I'm very blunt. If somebody asked me why I wouldn't put them on the main show if I've seen them on recruitment, I will be very direct. Like, your arguments were not good. I don't think anybody was convinced. Or your mic quality's terrible. You're never going to get on the main show without that mic. Or honestly, you speak way too slow and you can't get the points out fast enough. And so you took up way too much time when you were trying to get out a point. Or
If you can be irreverent, if you can be irreverent to the demands that trans people are making and bringing up about your panel, why can't you be irreverent? Just not care, like
just
and
not
what-
care. It's not that I don't care. If somebody can bring me a concern and I can think it's garbage, right? Or I could think that the concern is like there's not
But
like
how many different people are going to bring this up before it's not garbage?
well, people have brought up period that I shouldn't have right-wing people. I shouldn't platform people on period. I should not talk to
No,
right-wing people.
I'm
No.
not
I
gonna
know
say
that's not what
that.
you're saying. That's not what you're saying, but that's what people say to me, right? Does that mean because they keep saying it that it's true? No, of course not.
I'm not talking about repetition meaning truth. I'm talking about there is a consistent problem that trans people are bringing up, and I've talked to many of them personally and watched them go through this, not just in your space, but it's very common in debate spaces. And I will say this much: you could probably tone down the toxic masculinity in your presentation. I was pretty disappointed about the thing with Haas, and I think that that does fuel these over assertive responses to trans people who speak out, because it's this like I need to be like super aggressive and stuff like that. When like
You mean
that
infrared?
also, yes.
Yeah. What
So
about what went wrong there?
I think you kind of I'm gonna say normalize, but
The fighting
made,
thing?
you made that kind of approach to somebody look really strong. And the thing is like a lot of trans women when we've transitioned, we're not aggressive like that, both before and after. And so we get constantly hit with this, and you say, oh well, that's just the way it is. Well, yeah, well, that's going to be in its own right a form of gatekeeping, and if that's working against a certain group of people because of the nature of the approach, then there's like this needs to be addressed. Now, I don't know how much you actually need to address toxic masculinity in your community because I don't know your community that well.
I
That made me
this
worried. That made me worried. All I'm saying.
I guess like for me, like I did that because it was fun, right? I enjoyed it. I enjoyed showing that infrared's a pussy, right? When he acts so Top Gun, I'm super macho. I can like look at these soy boy leftists, and then I take that performance that he puts on, throw it back in his face, make it real for a second, and he can't do anything, right? That was the point of why I did the whole boxing thing with infrared, right? I did it because it was fun, and I did it to kind of show that this person's faking it, that this person isn't really the macho man that he pretends to be on the internet. I don't believe that it would be smart for me to throw away the idea of being really aggressive in debates or using tactics against people like that when I know it'll be effective because other
You
people
didn't
can't
have a
do it.
debate. That wasn't a debate, though, Dylan.
It was a debate, and it descended into something that wasn't a debate. It descended into his character, and it showed him to have a weak character, right? It showed him to be somebody who pretends to be somebody
Right.
he isn't.
I'm not actually going to disagree with that, like your perspective. From an outside perspective, though, that was mine. And I could also see how like other people who idolize toxic masculinity, just out of the normativity of doing so, also saw the same thing that I saw. And that's what I mean by like thinking about what kind of audiences you're attracting and what kind of overlap you're creating. Because, yeah, if trans people are like, the way that you're networking us with these fascists in order for us to be in your space, and I'm sorry, I said fascists, I meant reactionaries. The way that you're networking us with these reactionaries in this space is very violent towards us, then like you
Well,
like
what do you mean there's when you say they're violent towards us? Like obviously they're not making
harassment is
threats on my
violence.
show.
Well, no. Again,
Can't we
like
just call?
you're
Can we?
confining things to your show, and that's the issue here.
Well, I don't think anybody's ever been assaulted or stabbed or shot as a result of anything that's ever happened on my show. I don't think that. I wouldn't really file harassment under violence. Harassment is bad, but I wouldn't file like harassing somebody in DMs or spamming, even like spamming slurs as violent. I would classify it under like maybe you can like classify it under hate speech or like disgusting behavior. Most certainly, but it's not violence.
So maybe we have to work from the top down here. Do you think that it's possible that violence can exist outside of an individual's actions?
Yes, I think I know where you're going to go with this, but if this works, then like debate about these issues, period, need to be completely scrapped, and debate with right wingers, period, need to be
No, I
completely
didn't
scrapped.
say period. That's going back to my previous argument. I said that there's certain debates that we could still be having. Actually, I think the trans athlete debate is one that does need more exploration, especially as more information comes out and stuff like that. But there are other things that, like, if we bring up the trans bathroom thing again, I'm sorry, but like, there just is no evidence of that, and there is no further data that could probably come out that's going to make that happen. So the other side can only be wrong, and the debate is only giving them a chance to legitimize their incorrect position. I know that you, like in your mind, you have this mechanic that's going on where no, they're wrong, so they're going to get disproven. Believe it or not, I've argued that position at the same time when I thought what people were saying about spaces like yours was actually more about debate in general, and I felt kind of under attack. And the mistake that we're making here is like assuming that like just because that has potential, that these other things that are going on are minimized. They're not. And especially with someone like you with power, it's very important to like ask myself, like, if I can't do anything about this and my platform is so big that this is inevitable, is my platform simply too big? Because you say that you're doing this for entertainment, so that we can get more views and stuff like that. But it's also at
Well,
the
that's
point
part of
where
it,
it
yeah.
can't, yeah, well, part of it, sure. And I do understand that you have some sort of positive, well-meaning view in your mind. I'm not saying that like you're weaponizing your ambivalence, but I do think that the ambivalence is part of the issue of how stuff like this can happen, and it goes unrecognized because I'm sorry, but harassment is violence. Like no matter who it's against, but it's a much different form of violence for trans people, especially when it feels like in these spaces we can't go and make one wrong statement without having us like literally like there's being dogpiled on a panel. That's one thing. Then there's being dogpiled behind the scenes where like you can't go anywhere without and say anything without being discredited immediately and told how much of an awful person you are.
I
And
don't think
sure,
anybody uses violence in this way, though, at least in our society, because the difference is
it's social
there's
violence.
there's difference. I don't like this. I see how that could easily be used in a certain way that would be dishonest, because this is how it'll be framed. How it's going to be framed is Dylan is bringing trans people on a show, and then people are violent towards them, and people are going to hear that and they're going to think, holy shit, people are getting like stabbed on Dylan Burns panels.
No, okay,
There's
I'll
the,
100%
that's because that's how
clarify.
society, but that's
It's a
how society.
specific kind.
It's
But
not,
this,
but
but
that's you can't even say specific kind of violence, because this is, I think we're watering down
no, this
this
is the
term.
violence of misogyny. This is the violence of cis and heteronormativity that happens where people in their minds find it easier to delegitimize the trans people in your spaces, especially like the so-called centrist, than they do to
Are people
legitimize
violent towards
reactionary.
conservatives on my show?
Probably a bit. I'm not going to say zero.
But see, this is becomes like worthless then, because then
But
if somebody, because then
how come your community is both good at being at doing what they do to react to reactionaries and fascists as they do to the trans people who they disagree with?
what?
In the past, I have seen your community go absolutely apeshit on people who were disagreeing with you at the time.
Yes.
I don't, I'm impervious to it. In fact, like I have a great privilege there where I just emotionally disconnect from anything that happens online if I'm being
Mm-hmm.
serious. But watching that happen was like, oh my God, like, can these people not just be wrong once on something without absolute backlash? Now, I'm going to give you some credit here. Probably a lot of people who act as part of your community who come from these other reactionary places, reactionary communities that find out about you through your show. But as a whole, as like a social dynamic, when I say that it's forcing people out, well, forcing people, especially marginalized groups, out of anywhere is violent. I'm sorry, that is just a like a social justice perspective of violence. Even if you're not a leftist, social justice is like a very liberal thing. So, you know, I
Violent, but I
I'm glad you're
always
willing to
when I
ask the question of where it is, but like the problem is like you can't be finding reasons to be like, oh well, it's too mystical for me, because that's the issue, is that it's
well
meant to be subversive.
having trans people forced out of a space is bad, but there's a difference between verbally like being like insulting somebody to the point where they don't want to be in a space anymore, and somebody takes a bat and like beats somebody, right? There's a
I'm not
huge gap
disagreeing with
between
that.
there's a huge gap here, but when people hear violence, it's physical force. People think of this physical force. It's a huge barrier that people jump from the internet, online, talking in chat rooms, to the use of physical violence, which is how people like describe violence. But if they hear violence, they don't think that somebody just ratioed somebody else on Twitter or harassed them in private or anything like very like mean rhetoric towards them that is like over the line.
No,
When people
it's usually
use these
like
words, it's in
proportionate
reference to
threats and
physical
stuff.
force. If
It's
it's
usually,
threats, yeah, that's the threat of violence. The threat of violence, yes.
but it like I'm saying like they're like as much as you think it's a leap, like no, it's more of just like a downhill slippery slope. Where yes, like threats might be more rare than like being told that you're not a real woman, and then being told that you're not being a real woman might be relatively rare to like having like a big streamer do a stream specifically on you and how dumb all of your points are, as if you didn't make one single good point, which by the way is all too common in this space. uh, I think like the contribution of this has created like a net narrative that the trans people in this space are too complainy, but in reality, like we're like when we're saying please don't make us feel forced out, that's literally the other way of saying like please don't de facto gatekeep us, right? So when we're talking about all the ways this stuff happens and like to be super vigilant, I think like the first thing that you need to avoid doing is being like, oh, well, here's like all of these excuses I have to not be on board with this. It's like, and if you're bringing up like the definition of violence thing for some other reason, I'm sorry. I was just like, that's how I took it.
Okay. I guess for me, when I hear violence, this has escalated the situation way past any just conversation happening on the internet or debate or argument to a point where I need to get law enforcement involved, right?
Well, no,
And if threats are
I've
happening,
said this is subversive, right? Like, hopefully, like am I not getting through? So what that
is like subversive violence, so like institutional violence or like violence that like what do like
if it's
violence that
institutional is from like the abilities that are given to people through the platform. As far as like it's more of like a social violence, like I said, where people don't feel like they're strong enough to be in these spaces, so they feel inadequate, or they don't feel
well then
like
there
they
will
have.
always be violence in my community though. I'm using violence. I use violence when I say I don't think you're good enough to be on my show.
Okay, so what I'm saying is when people are already putting a lot on the line and risking a lot of stuff to be on your show, then maybe it's time to like actually question the size of your platform if you there's nothing that you can actually do, because like it's bad enough, and I can't believe I even have to point this out. It's bad enough that I can't name names without worrying that something will be
Well,
generated
okay,
against me.
so
I'm not saying that's just a tribute
I
to
don't
you.
like that. I don't for me that's I feel like that's pretty like if I was to you, like I'd be like, you know, you've done some terrible things to some people, and you're like, who? I was like, oh, I can't say. So you see
Dylan,
how
you've had
frustrating that is?
confrontations with these people talking to you about it. You're just ignoring that.
Well, is this about no comment chick? Is that what this is about, or is this about like
About
who?
multiple people.
Okay, well then, if I've disagreed with it at the time, then I probably have valid reason. I probably agree with myself.
Like that's really convenient. I'm saying
But
though,
yeah, but
that
it's
like
also very convenient that you can't even name names, so
trans
we can't.
women,
So we just gotta say the specter of trans
yeah.
people
So
are
so
against you,
basically,
Dylan. Like it's okay.
basically, well, I mean, if they want to bring up this stuff to you or like talk about more general things, if that works better, because it's certainly not just limited to your space. But the treatment that trans people are getting, yes, is violent, and it's a trend. The trend of violence is specifically not being treated as viable the moment that we have a bad take. Whereas think about the counter reality for a reactionary. You're literally treated as viable for having a bad take.
If you having this discussion with me right now caused me to shut down Hippy Dippy, would that be you using the using violence to take down my platform? Because you intimidated me out of me possibly like wanting to continue to do this?
This really comes back to me like getting people to ask if a true ally would use their platform in the way that
What
you're
what you, could you answer my question?
That's
Like
not my goal.
well,
I,
your goal isn't to answer my question?
well, you're bringing this up, and it's
Well,
just
it's
not my
just
goal.
this use of the
I,
word
ar-
violence just feels so flimsy, right? Because then
I mean,
you're being violent towards me, I'm being violent towards you by not letting you on my show.
I'd love
We're
to
all
have
being
another
violent towards everybody.
discussion on. Well, no, I'd love to have another discussion on how violence exists beyond physical and systemic means. But I feel like that's besides the point, considering what I'm saying is again, this is like these are all cases for why people would validly be suspicious of your usage of the platform.
Okay, but I'm just saying that what you're saying right now could easily just be used against like I'm being violent towards you by not having you on. You're being violent towards me if I end up shutting down my show, or even if I don't end up shutting
I
down my show
never
because
made
of
a
this
statement of
conversation.
you're being violent against sex, right? I said your space is violence
My
against
s-
trans people.
my space is violence against trans people. Okay, because they because of the
Because there's this
harassment that can.
trend, yeah, there's this trend of hostility against trans people. And you specifically, by being more selective of them than you would be of reactionaries, pretty much like negates our ability to speak on a broader level than we would be
And the
able to with
violence
you.
would just wouldn't the violence just get worse then? Not to mention, this means I'm violent
Of
towards basically
violence.
everybody is having violence against them on my platform. Then, especially the right wingers, they're then going to be the main victim of violence because they're the main victim of people who are
Well, don't get me
actually going.
wrong. Part of this is raising awareness of the fact that when trans people come on, they're facing violence, and like you said, they should know this. But on the
Well, then
other hand,
everybody's facing violence. It's like a death rumble in there. You can barely get out
yeah.
alive.
But on the other hand, by making sure that reactionaries have a more frequent voice on there and a more diverse voice, and that they can constantly treat the discussion as if they won because it constantly comes back up again as if they haven't lost, it it's way more conducive to their status quo, like keeping the way things are, which is keeping trans people out, than like actually creating an environment which actively brings trans people in despite the inherent violence of things when you just let go of the controls.
Do you mind if I
So,
open?
sure, geek.
All right, real quick. Uh, huh, I like to learn from my mistake, but for that I need to have mistake to learn from. For that I need like concise examples. I need something, and I understand that like.
Can we talk about this in private some other time? Maybe then, just because, like I
Yes,
said, I'm 100% from my experiences firsthand. I'm comfortable with bringing up people's names in a way like this.
I need
That's it.
names because
Okay,
like
but I'm gonna be clear though. Then I'm going to just say I mean, this is worthless to me because you're saying there's these issues, what are they? And then you can't say any. And nobody should
I
really
I have
believe
multiple
you if you're
issues.
not. But you haven't given any examples of this really playing out in real time on my show that like has been brought to my attention or like, hey Dylan, this is how violence on your platform led to because we're using the word violence here, right? And when we're using these words, like this escalates the conversation, right? We do realize like saying, hey Dylan, somebody after your show was called a slur, and that's terrible, is different than, hey
And
Dylan, after your show, someone had violence done upon them. Like the
what I say.
levels here are like
Oh, sorry, really? I didn't know, but I'm not trying to have anyone take away that like your show causes physical violence. I do think that exclusion can be emotionally violent on trans people, so we have to consider that.
who did we exclude?
Geek.
I'm sorry, like, you bring up issues, like, this is the problem, and this is the thing that
And this is
happens
the
every
problem with the
time.
issue, though. You don't understand how this trend itself is so harmful for trans people that we need to actually start doing something to prevent it. Whereas,
Okay,
like, you're like,
that
oh,
works
well,
for
why can't you
Dylan.
bring up names?
That
Why
works for
can't you bring
Dylan,
up?
not for me. That argument works for Dylan. It doesn't work for me.
Okay.
I
I'm
don't even
not
know if it
Dylan.
works
I
for
don't have a
Dylan.
big platform. I don't have like all of the issues that you could get to bringing this kind of issues to people. And if there isn't me, there is
Okay.
Danabo. There is plenty of people
Oh,
around, and that's the problem. And like, I don't know. I'm trying to look for prescription. I'm trying to look to ways, like every time that people bring this kind of issues, I'm trying to look for ways to make stuff better. But no one is capable to come up with a single fucking example of this shit happening. And that's the thing that's triggering. That's why I don't take this shit seriously. I'm sorry.
I mean, like, if like trans people come to you and say we feel forced out and there's no solutions and that's enough to make you not take it seriously, then I don't think you actually care about the issue of them being forced out. And again, this comes back to the
Who
point
came
where
up
if we're
with
at the
this?
scale,
We don't have the person that came up with this issue. That's the problem. No
not one
one at
person
no
came
point
up with this
whatsoever.
issue. I'm telling you right now that trans people in general in these debate spaces who try to be active
Well,
members get pushed out.
well, but the problem is also, and while I think
Sorry, I'm going to
mostly
tell you
geek is, yeah, I'm gonna say geek is mostly just molding French right now, right?
Yes.
But
I'd be
the
quiet.
thing is, for me, it's like I hear this, but then I will be approached by other trans people who want to come on my show, and I give them that platform, and they want to come back, and they are not pushed out of the space, and they actively want to come back on the platform. And this is probably one of the most safest environments on Twitch for people to engage with the right as a left winger in a controlled environment with certain controls in place so it doesn't get out of hand, right? And if somebody like afterwards they're sending community toward like harassment towards anybody or anything like that, like approach us and we will absolutely ban those people. And so for me, it's like I never want to create this. I guess my goal isn't to create a perfectly safe environment for everyone involved. That is not my goal at all. My goal is to create one of the safest environments I can possibly do while doing what I'm doing. And I think that while I do want to bring on more trans people, absolutely, right? And I don't think you want me to like bring on bad trans voices or like when I say that I mean like people who are not good at debate, not like any voice that is trans is bad, but like somebody who's not good at what we're looking for here is that I think we have different standards for what I'm looking for as what I'm like trying to put on and like the type of voices I would bring on. One example of this is when you were on Twitter, you said all Dylan has to do is to give me a valid reason for why he won't have me on or let me on to prove it's not merely a passive aggressive attack at all the trans women who have embarrassed him, but he won't because I'm right that he
that
wants to
was dumb.
exploit this power, right? And when
I
I
was
hear
writing a lot
this,
of stuff between my jobs, by the way, and I should have thought that one through definitely because that was not what I was thinking. I would like most of the time it like I wasn't even thinking about me not being on the panels. So I'm sorry that was like a lapse in
I
judgment.
guess when I read that, and I said this at the time, it makes me feel like it's like a personal spite that you felt personally spited because I didn't bring you on.
I mean, if
And
it was personal, I would have brought it up way sooner. It's just now that I'm leaving this space, it's very much like I feel bad seeing what I've seen with the treatment of trans people, their firsthand experiences that they've shared with me, and not saying anything, just like slamming the door shut and hoping to have like a better career as like I don't know, gamer streamer or something, whatever I plan to do. And so like for me, like I want to be very vocal that I'm leaving because it doesn't feel like I'm ever good enough for this space because by default there's a lot of forces working against people like me in here. The stuff I brought up about you was started by Danbo because it like I really was like what qualifications. I guess you've given good enough reasons on like a surface level for why not to do what you've done and agreeing with the idea that like I only want good debaters on there. Well, I think you're really discounting the value of experiences and people's voices on this because I've met people who I don't think are necessarily great debaters, but when they talk about trans issue, they're trans. So they can literally just shut down falsehoods faster than most cis people because part of being trans is going through certain things that just are undeniably true to you at that point once you've experienced them. And so
Yeah.
it's like your space can sometimes let these things, like these counter narratives to our true existence, exist much longer than they should.
So I guess for me, anytime I have
Sorry,
a
that was all over
conversation,
the place. Maybe I should.
I'll address the last point. Anytime I host a conversation about trans issues, black issues, anything like this, I want to make sure I always have a trans person or a black person on that show. But I
just
also face
one?
wait. Mm-hmm.
It's just look. I don't want to interrupt, but you're letting me interject, I guess.
Yeah, I'm letting you interject.
It's just like if you're gonna have again 3 transphobes on there and just 1 trans person, you're giving the transphobes an easier time. I'm sorry, even if you're not letting them say the quiet parts so loud.
So I guess for me, right? I believe that so I'm gonna give, this is a little unrelated, but I think it's important for people to get an idea of how I make my show. I can't just have trans people on the shows where we're talking about trans issues. I cannot just have black people on the show where I'm just talking about black.
Just have trans
Let,
people though. That's not what I'm asking either.
please let me fit. I just said that
But like,
fuck.
you're mischaracterizing my
No,
argument.
I'm
All
not.
I'm
You
saying
didn't
is give
listen to
them
me.
just
You
the-
didn't listen to me. You didn't listen to me. I said this is unrelated, but I want to say this because I want to give people an idea about how I make my show.
Okay, fine. Sorry, I missed the unrelated part. I'll try to listen better.
Okay. I do that. I need to make sure, and I do this, I try my best to make sure I have black people in the room when we're not talking about black issues, trans people in the room because we're not talking about trans issues. Because, number one, I don't want to tokenize people. I don't want to have them on only when we're talking about trans issues or black issues because I don't want trans or black people to feel like, oh, I have you on when we talk about the black thing. Then when we talk about like the economy or something that still affects you but just isn't black centric issue, only black issue, then we don't need the card for you anymore. I don't want anybody to ever feel like that. And so I always want to make sure that I bring them on so they always feel like this door is open for all conversations to all people, right? Now, when it comes to specifically like a debate about the trans issue, I will always make sure that I try to have a higher than average rate of trans people on that show. Now, it will not only be trans people on that show for the left, which is usually the quote unquote like trans positive side, even though we do have people like Taftaj who like ride the middle or ride the center right?
Well, it's because the trans movement is an emancipatory movement. So as soon as you concede to reactionary talking points, you've kind of like removed your ability to actually advocate for what trans people are truly fighting.
So you're saying by even having the debate in and of itself and including the right,
it depends.
I guess for me, like right now we just went off the presidency of Donald Trump and we are seeing a huge spike in anti-trans rhetoric, and we've seen a lot of anti-trans rhetoric and anti-queer rhetoric in the United States, right? And for me, I believe that these spaces are going to exist in our space and have a social purpose. A social purpose to either A, equip people with the tools necessary to dismantle these arguments. B, I think it is necessary for democracy to function, for discussions to occur between people who disagree, but that just applies to all issues. I can understand how you could say, like this issue doesn't really necessarily need to be discussed, but I'm just saying like in democracy, discussions need to happen if you want to live in a democracy, right? And like I also believe that on these shows, generally it is the left and trans people who do the best in these trans debates. And when it comes to this idea of like, well, it needs to be like for every transphobe, there needs to be another trans person checking them, right? I match these debates up like Pokemon. I'm a Pokemon master and I got to catch them all, right? When it comes to my debates. I try to specifically set it up so that I know that the people on this side are going to be able to defend the points that they're saying, or they're going to be able to engage and have that that engagement. And it is not, if I just pour personal experience on one side of the debate for trans people, it's going to get complicated if there's a statistical argument that is made, or if there is a science something argument that's made that is outside the bounds of somebody's personal experience. Somebody, for example, I'm queer, but if someone was to ask me the percentage of gay people who have to go through homelessness or like something that I don't know the specifics about, then it's going to be a trouble for me. But if I have somebody on with me who might not even be gay, who might have that, then us together are going to be able to make the better argument. And I'm matching it up like that in these debates. So it's, to me, it's not just about like for every transphobe we must have a trans voice. It's about how can we best set up this side, the left-wing side, not for failure, but how can we set them up so we know that they can make these arguments effectively and are well equipped to deal with the debate ahead.
I basically just want to give a closing statement at this point. If you want to follow up with one as well, then I guess if you has anything to say, because I am getting pretty tired. I had a lot to do today before I even got to this. So, is
Okay.
that cool?
Sure. I guess like I don't know. I guess for me, I feel weird about this debate altogether because I feel like the words that we're using in this conversation are very different from like the words, like for example, when we talked about violence. The reason why I reacted so viscerally to that is because these words, when heard in this space, like once you use a different word in place of another word that you could use, like for example, harassment, once we use violence, it's going to be interpreted very different than by most people. The same way that if I said this is a riot versus a insurrection, right? This situation is going to be treated very differently, right? When we use these words that might have like I just want to make sure we're using the word that is going to describe to the most people what we accurately mean, and that's why I had the most visceral reaction to that. And when it comes to like my space and like not platforming like true leftists, like I do believe I platform true leftists. I think leftists always disagree about what a true leftist is. So one leftist saying that other leftists are not true leftists is just run-of-the-mill leftism. I'm sure that some people would tell me you're not a true leftist because you're not of the right stripe of Pol Potism or whatever the fuck, right? So for me, like hearing from a socialist or a Marxist or whatever you call yourself when it comes to like a leftist, like say that I don't have enough true leftists on when I have Kevin Logan and Vosh and Lonerbox and Demon Mama and all these people, like I guess I would just say like I'm positive all of these people would disagree with you, that they would say they're true leftists. And
Sorry,
well, we're
not
doing
saying
closing
that.
statements, yeah. And like finally, I guess like for me, I don't want to create an environment that excludes trans people at all. I want to create an environment where people feel it is the safest place for them to engage with people who they regularly would not be able to in other parts of Twitch. In Twitch, there's not a lot of spaces where people can engage with the right. It just doesn't exist. Mine is one of the few that they can. And I think it's important to keep the space not only partially entertained, but also grounded in what the reality is in the majority of this country. Because the reality of this country is not people are around a table like debating like what are we going to go for, syndicalism or anarcho-communism, right? The reality of this country is we're debating mainstream conservatism, which has extremely queerphobic, extremely transphobic. We engage it on a national level, on a local level, and I want to make sure people are grounded in that. And I want to make sure that the conversations that we're having, the debates we're having, feel relevant to people's everyday life and what they see in media and what they consume. But I also understand that the mainstream is harmful. Mainstream America, when it comes to trans and queer people, is extremely harmful. And that's why I put the controls I do in place. But I would never advocate for anybody to ever come on my show if they felt like they couldn't handle what my show is. But if there's ever any instance of harassment after a show or something like that, if anyone wants to send me like evidence of that, then I will ban that person permanently because I do not allow that behavior on my platform. And I would even have conversations with the community members involved. As in, I would, if let's say it came from somebody else's community, I would go to them and be like, look, your member, this person is harassing other guests. Please make them stop because if we keep having this issue from your community, it's going to be hard to have you on again. And I'd be willing to even do that. Which is actually, I think this is, I don't think we've done that before. I think, but I would be willing to make that change if it made people feel more welcome.
Okay, well, the point was for this discussion to maybe give some perspective on some things that are going on that, like I said, bother me leaving this space by no longer doing panels. Yeah, so I do appreciate you having me on to talk, of course. I actually didn't expect that. I'm just going to say but mostly because a lot of the other times I reached out, you didn't respond, but maybe you were busy or something. I guess that's possible too. There's a lot of subjectivity in what you're saying, like the standards are and stuff like that. And I get that, like from an optics standpoint, it's respectable, at least to like not want trans people to lose debates. However, I like given the subjectivity of the standards for who will win a debate and the countering forces that I've pointed out, like how always rehashing these discussions kind of makes it seems like it actually never ends, no debate, and the debate is never won. Really, we have to question what's actually going on here. And so like the reason I'm saying violence specifically is because that's what it ends up being for trans people. Now, it may not be the case for like people looking at this from the top down and saying like, what is this? That makes sense. And I can agree with that. It's all I'm going to say is that it takes a little bit of creativity to understand it. And that's also kind of like coming around what the solutions are, because I don't actually know the specifics of your platform. I don't know the specifics of the decisions you've made this entire time. But I also kind of recognize and am worried by the idea that you can't actually get rid of a lot of the people that will generate entertainment if you were to recognize the subversive, and that's the key word here, subversive ways that trans people become targeted through that. That's why I brought up the issue of scale. And I'm not asking you to get rid of your platform. I do think you can find ways to spread out your power amongst other people. And that could be a great way to be a trans ally, such as other trans people who might have panels, collaborating with them and stuff like that. Because especially like with inexperience, I know that like I've tried to have a couple of panels and I wish I had a little bit of like support on that. Stepping out just some other points. The biggest reason these spaces remain violent, though, is because we always try to like characterize these things with like with specifics and words, but in reality, like that's not how people harass trans people. That's not how this stuff works. They literally look at what we're saying that we're looking for, and they start doing something else, something deeper. To the point where we don't even actually always know what we did specifically to cause this. It just usually correlates with the last time we, embarrassed somebody on a panel or something. At least for me, I can't speak for all trans people. This is probably a little bit more complicated for others than it is for me. I also say that, like personally, as far as like death threats and stuff like that go, I have gotten my God, I am privileged. They wouldn't affect me much anyways, because I have a lot going on in terms of not worrying about that for multiple reasons, but also in terms of like that emotional attachment stuff. But when I can't detach as easily from hearing what other people go through, and that's what's hardest for me, is that we have this barrier of like, well, how is this violence? What am I doing wrong specifically? Yada yada yada. But like, if what trans people were saying about the issue, especially a lot of the people who were more common in these spaces and fallen away, if their voices weren't minimized, specifically by a lot of the time being told that they're crazy, then I don't think it'd be as hard to recognize these issues. It's almost as if they got pushed out because they were able to recognize the issue, not by you, but more like the spaces that actually use that violence. And so it worries me that your space is going to become more and more isolated. You're going to continually attract more and more people with the spectacle, and it's going to keep the conversation from actually ever moving forward in the true online zeitgeist. Oh yeah, and you pointed out like the words thing. For the most part, the words that like trans people and like the minorities need to describe their oppression will be a little bit different than what the words that like normal people use to describe things would be, simply because like their problems exist outside of what is normally viewed by the status quo. And so if we're talking about like in terms of being trans allies specifically, recognizing forms of violence that are allocated for trans people which don't exist within our normative views of violence is a very important way of making sure that these things don't perpetuate. So I get that, like, I see what you're saying with like not being confusing about violence and stuff like that. I don't feel like this is something I would probably try to refer to a couple other sources and then write down like a summary for because it is complicated and I'm not great at making lists in my head. So I'll defer to that to like if you're interested, try to look into more about like, how specifically the left talks about social violence and also this thing called biopolitics. I know Foucault read about it, and Foucault's like this philosophically brain dude, but there's lots of good videos that summarize it, and I think that there is a biopolitical situation going on here. Not so much of like the body, but more so the ability to exist in this space. So I have to make that distinction there. But if we're not thinking about this, if we're not like, and you are thinking about this, it does sound like so. Then things can get really bad. It's just my position, which is why I said like the hands on the control thing.
One last question before this wraps up. You said that like I only wanted my only like purpose of bringing on like the trans people I bring on. I only bring on trans people with clout, and that's like my barrier is like if you have clout as a trans person, then you get on my show. If you're a trans person without clout, you basically get fucked, right? Um, my main barrier, I mean, obviously, like viewership plays into everything we book because we want to book a show that gets high viewership. That's
You've
business.
already said you're the
Um,
biggest, so when does that lose
well,
priority?
because I want to get bigger, always. I always want to grow. I mean, I'm a businessman.
But then
I
this
want
problem
to.
is going to get more and more out
Well,
of control.
well, no, because the thing is, the bigger my platform gets, the more valuable the platform gets, and so the bigger it gets, the more useful will be to platform trans people who are smaller viewership, which I do. I mean, just last platform, again, I platformed a trans masculine person who doesn't have a huge audience. I'm not trying to be painted as a hero for that or something,
Sure,
but
and yeah,
I need to have a
I'll
big
give it
platform,
credit.
and I need to give my platform big for it to even be useful in the first place.
And
And if I
sorry that I
can't keep
spoke
the
in absolutes. It was just me being lazy. I'm sorry.
Okay. I just think a lot of people. I want to emphasize that the only reason that we're even having this conversation in the first place is because I have this platform, right? And if I didn't make a lot of the business decisions I did make to get it to where it is, we wouldn't even have the platform in the first place. And so if I make a lot of changes fundamentally to what made my platform what it is and what made it big, if I make too much change to the point where it's no longer what it was, it shells with what it used to be, we're not platforming right wingers of a quality anymore that people want to tune in to watch, or we're not platforming the stars people tune in to watch for, then I can run into an issue where we're not going to have the conversation anymore because the platform I've had is gone. It's no longer the size it was. A great example of this, the Hippy Dippy Championship is something that gets a lot of criticism, and I would assume from your criticisms, you probably don't like it very much. It probably is like the pinnacle of this kind of entertainment-based, like politics is for fun type thing that it gets a lot of criticism, which I agree that politics shouldn't really just be like this, like, oh, like, wow, having fun. That's why I also engage in real politics. Um, for me,
Sure.
I wouldn't have this platform if it wasn't for that type of stuff. And my viewership has declined after I stopped the Hippy Dippy Championship, reflecting the fact that this is part of the stuff that gave me this platform in the first place.
I I really want to do something that's actually kind of inspired by competitive nature, but relies on teamwork and people to absolutely be prepared in order to quote win. Whereas my biggest criticism of the Hippy Dippy Championship is that it was a spectacle, and whoever won the spectacle, not who was the most prepared to actually win the debate. Because even being informed is a performative thing to some degree. I can be very informed, but I really suck at making it entertaining. So I 100% know that there's something like that going on there. I I think that what you're saying applies to people who aren't established, but I think that your argument falls apart with the bigger you get, and especially when people are saying like, look, the airtime and the viewership that you're kind of hoarding in a way keeps them away from us, and
It,
they're not viewing us because you're doing these huge spectacles that attracts people on less informed bases than what they're trying to do. And yeah, I think part of like if you're going to say that like letting people be informed is taking a backseat, then specifically trans people have a reason to be worried because that means that like misinformation can slide through when, say, for instance, certain trans allies aren't keen enough to know when things that incite violence against trans people are being entertained.
I guess for me, like we put a lot of disclaimers about like, please go get other sources. Do not use this as a primary source of
But people
information.
just
We
naturally do
try.
that. That's just human behavior.
That is just human behavior, yes. But to have debate is to um know that somebody could bring in misinformation, and it is the people who comes on responsibility in many ways to like counter that misinformation. I can't. There's not really even like if you look at like CNN debates or like the most high like the high level debates like between presidential candidates, a lot of times like misinformation seeps through, and it is the other candidate's responsibility in order to counter the misinformation that they hear. And that's what I put at the responsibility of the other panelists when they're debating somebody on the show. And it's part of the reason why we put these content warnings on, because it is, and it's a content warning that even like mainstream like debates don't have. It's about this misinformation.
So I've made most of the points I need to make. All I say is that there is a point, and I think you should recognize this. There's a point to where things do get out of control, where something can become a threat to the trans people in this space, and it's so big and so crazy all the time because you have so many replies in your tweets or whatever that it's hard to keep track of. And you asked if like the hippy dippy being removed would be ideal. It's like, no, I actually think that there are topics that would be great to be talked about on the hippy dippy. I think that there are also topics that just allow, like I said, reactionaries to have more privilege in those spaces through means of not just appearance that I explained. So it's not as simple as just bringing trans people on, unfortunately. You said that you do other forms of media, and I do often link those forms of media. So I would say 100% you don't have to do these panels anymore. You're established. You have your stake in everything. Believe it or not, like I know this sounds crazy, but there's probably actually like a lot more you could do from this point than to do the same thing over and over again, preventing people who are trying to do the same thing, possibly with different dynamics and possibly who may be trans themselves, uh, to have that space that you're occupying.
The pe-
Wait a second.
Sorry,
I
go
gotta
ahead.
wrap this up because people are sleeping, and so I want to say like I'm sorry. There's so many things, but I want to make sure I put a bow on this. There's two things I wanted to say. I guess for me, when it comes to the death threat stuff, like to me, I guess it's harder for that to have an impact on me. Like when I hear it, I know it's bad, but like I guess for me, like I've kind of normalized that a little bit in my brain because as a streamer, like death threats are almost like a part of the business. And I'm not
I
saying that as
understand.
in like it's okay,
I
but it's like
understand.
kind of just something like you just deal with. And I'm not trying to say it's okay. It's just like it's so normalized, sadly. It's like, for example, uh swatting. Like it is something that literally should come with like prison time. But it's something as a streamer where we just kind of accept the risk because like that's just the business we're in. And
Yeah,
for
I've
me, it's
heard
like
about it. Yeah.
I deal with
Sorry.
it in a really weird way personally because like the way people make death threats to me is, hey, I'm trying to geolocate this picture you took so I can give this information to the Russian government so they could kill you, right? In fucking Ukraine, which is like a really weird way that I think a lot of people don't like experience. Is this ever-present threat of like people actually trying to get you killed, legitimately get you killed, like you know. I don't want to like make this a pity party, but it's like a weird thing. So I understand that it's bad, but I guess it's also maybe hard for me to relate to like how do we stop the death threats? Because I'm just like I don't know. Like I've even if I stopped the show, I would still be getting death threats anyway. Everybody would still be getting death threats. It's just the only difference is we have a large crowd here, and with more crowd, there's going to be more people who would make death threats. So this is like a whole internet issue, not just a My Show issue. And lastly, when you talk about the size of my show, I don't look in my show relative to the size of political Twitch because I believe political Twitch is not like my end goal, like period. I want to like always grow outside into the rest of Twitch or to the rest of YouTube or like make my shows bigger. It's part of the reason why I'm in Ukraine. This is not the area like political Twitch is supposed to touch, which is like this really real life like journalism. But that's not like where I limit myself to. I want to do stuff outside of that sphere. I want to do stuff that's bigger than that. I always think in that way. That's why I was even like planning a while ago to do like an in-person mega hippy dippy championship event in an actual wrestling ring. Like the whole shabab, we would have like fireworks, and it would be like, because I'm always thinking in that way, because I want to make it bigger, because I can only help people grow to the amount of influence and power I have, and to the amount of platform I have. And so if I want to help people build real careers out of this, I got to have a real audience, a real platform, which right now isn't even that big. Like, I'm like, to me at least, when it comes to like what I want to do with my platform.
So yeah, I think I will try to make this the last thing I say. I don't know. I'm pretty impulsive, so but it for me, it's like it saddens me to know that I guess like the best chances that people have from breaking out of a certain uh, or the chances that people have from being at your level where they can also do that are limited by whether or not a you have the capacity to do that, b you think you have the right balance of disagreement, which again I don't think needs to come from platforming right wingers. I think you can be more creative than that. And most importantly, like, okay, I lost my point. Like I said, I'm getting tired.
Real quick,
But if you want to respond to that,
I want to jump in on one thing. Sorry,
sure.
Dylan. This idea that like if Dylan like stopped his show, like the platform, like the panel scene is like like not distributed like evenly. Like for instance, I do the recruitment. I follow pretty much the same recipe as Dylan. He gets like 800 viewers. I get 20 on good days. Why? Because we're not doing the same type of like we're not doing the same type of panel at the end of the day. I'm not Dylan. I'm not like I'm not even interested in hosting the recruitment. But anyway, um, the point that I wanted to make is just that like this idea of like Dylan stopping his show like would like make other panel. No, people tune in for Dylan's show because it is the way it is, because we managed to we worked on this balance of like education and entertainment to manage to have this thing. And sure, we could have more debate and we could switch the debate and have like four lefties versus four lefties. But who the fuck cares? Like, that's not interesting. Like, I'm sorry, these panels already exist. There are plenty of panels like this. There are plenty of people interested in doing them. That's not the HippieDP. The goal of HippieDP is to manage this balance of like entertainment and education, and to be this kind of space, to fill this niche sector. I I don't understand this argument of like taking something and wanting to change its nature. Like that's something that
It's it's that it's a disproportionate nature to the other things that exist. Like specifically, like you're saying like the people who come to see the Hippie Dippy just wouldn't come online, I guess, to watch videos or Twitch if you didn't do it. That might be true for like maybe 5% of
no,
people.
I would say they
But the
will tune in
reality
to
of it
your
is,
panel, not to Twitch or anything, to your panel, to other panels. There are plenty of panels. The panel space is saturated. Always has been.
are you differentiating politics from non-political streams?
I'm saying that like if Delan didn't do the HippieDP, people wouldn't go to other panel on Twitch talking about politics.
I don't think that's true. And in fact, I think the
Why?
use of like the panel itself to reference its own necessity here is proof that like it's a subjective necessity and that it doesn't need to exist.
Why don't I get 400, at least 400 viewers? I do a political
Because
panel.
it's reach. It's just one got more reach and attention, specifically probably when the space needed like was unsaturated with panels, if anything. The
Dylan was a
question is
guest.
though,
Dylan hosted HippieDP recruitment. He retweet
the
like when I
question
go
is why do
live,
you need
and
to
I
go
get the
straight
same
up?
platform.
Why do you need to go straight up? Why can't you like go up and then level off and then
I don't.
like I
why
said,
why do we want to keep growing is the question, or what do you mean?
well in the end, like you're just preoccupying more space from other panels that might have different standards that might be more effective for not letting trans people get harassed, for example.
I
It
I
doesn't.
guess I guess I don't believe that's the case. I've seen the other panel scenes, and I just don't believe any. I believe we have the probably one of the more effective like like rule sets when it comes to like dealing with that. I mean, it
Oh,
could always get improved, but like I
it's
think the
pretty
ones
standard. It's
I
nothing I haven't seen before, and I've been in quite a
it's
few
been the
panels.
it's been the most consistent panel with this rule set. Like the other panels that have come up, they either don't have the rule set, or if they do, they have it for a bit and then they go away and then they crash. And I
Well,
don't think me turning in my show or like spreading it out, like my viewers tune into my show because it's my show. I don't know if they would tune in to somebody else's panel, like because they just want panels. Because what if they want a certain type of panel? It's like, for example, if WWE went away, I have no reason to believe they would all go to AEW or all go to TNA. Some of them might just stop watching wrestling.
It's not, yeah, it's not zero. I'll agree with that. I still think it's really low. And yeah, all I can say is that like this, a lot of this does seem to come down to belief. I've tried to at least substantiate why people might feel valid about the negative impacts of your space as well as the positive ones, because I think that both can exist at the same time, of course. And really, like again, if you don't want trans people to be pushed out, I'm more than happy to discuss examples. Another reason is again, I don't think I can properly defend any of those things. You have way more experience with it than I did, so uh, that like I want to also discuss with the other people what happened specifically. So I'm making sure that I can communicate that. But if you do want to talk about that more in private, that's the only way I feel comfortable doing it. Just to be clear.
One thing, it's not a, I'm sorry, it's not a let's agree to disagree. We got numbers to show that, like, yes, there's one panel that works and, like, other that doesn't. I want to, like, I'm sorry, this notion of, like,
Numbers aren't causal though. It doesn't actually tell me why. It just tells me that you've done better.
yes, why? Like, that's the question. Why do you think that is?
And for reasons that ultimately push out trans people and allow reactionaries to have dominance over your spaces.
I don't agree with that premise at all. You
Okay.
haven't demonstrated. Like, I'm sorry, I'm going to do the has meme, but, like, yeah, you didn't. We asked
I've
you
explained
example,
why.
and yeah, and you haven't provided them. I'm sorry.
But the reason
I
why
cannot
is
take
the
your
thing
claim
that
at
trans
face value.
people are experiencing, which, to my point, the fact that that's not enough for you shows why this problem persists in these spaces. Because when people hear that it's a problem, they're like, I can't see it in a way that I relate to, so it's not good enough for me.
It has nothing to
And
do with you being trans and everything with you, like, personally, and that's the problem.
it has
Okay, guys, we
nothing to
got
do
it.
with me being trans. I don't get
Shut it
it.
down. Shut
Okay.
it down.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm pretty tired.
Okay, guys. See you later.
Have a good night.